Welcome back to another episode of The Loco Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Laurin Conlon, and today I'm joined by our team mental health counselor, Rick, to talk about forgiveness. And if you guys listened to one of the Monday episodes, we actually talked about a question, infidelity and can you save a relationship? And we talked very specifically about that, but we did want to do a longer podcast on forgiveness in general. And this could be forgiveness in a relationship. This could be something, friend related or family related, or even forgiveness of self. So we wanted to do a full length episode on this topic because I really do think that it's warranted. And we kind of weave this into other things, but we haven't done an entire podcast on this.
No, we haven't. And it's a really important topic when it comes to a person healing. However, I want to make the distinction that forgiveness does not equal healing. It is not even really a part of, I don't want to say it's not necessarily a part of the healing process, but I think sometimes people assume that by forgiving somebody, I'm immediately healed, and that isn't the process. Just because you forgive somebody doesn't necessarily negate the trauma or the bad experiences or the things that have actually happened. And so I think there's a little bit of a misconception on what forgiveness is. And so I think for a lot of people, there's some general questions to start to consider when we're talking about forgiveness. Number one, what does it mean to actually forgive somebody? And I think for each person, these questions are answered individually. Why do we want to forgive them? What's kind of the motivating factor pushing us to forgive? And what benefit does forgiveness provide? What does it provide for us, to the world, to the future that we live in? I would say, what benefit does it provide the other person? Oftentimes, it's not about the other person. And when it is about the other person, sometimes it can get a little bit more confusing because we might be doing it for the wrong reasons instead of the right ones, which is to ultimately free ourselves. And that to me is what forgiveness really is a sense of freedom that comes with the process of forgiving. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, that's a really important distinction, that just because you have forgiven someone, it is a part of that healing process, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you are free and clear. I think that can be a hurdle for people, right? that can prevent them from moving forward because they haven't forgiven and they still hold a lot of anger, I said that so weird, anger or resentment, or just kind of these negative feelings towards a person or a situation. And that can, I would imagine, stop them from being able to move past it. But that doesn't mean that just because you have forgiven the person or the situation that now you have completely moved past it if you haven't done that work.
Right.
So they can coincide, but not necessarily.
Yeah, to put a little bit more of an example on it. If I was abused by my mother since I was born, and now I'm a 40-year-old man, I can forgive my mother for her wrongdoings, but it doesn't necessarily heal the damage that's been caused over the first 15, 20 years of psychological or physical or sexual abuse or whatever it was that occurred, right? Whatever attachment issues I have or trust issues I have or anger issues I have or depression or anxiety that was created in that sense, forgiving that person doesn't automatically eliminate the burden of healing. And I think sometimes we've misconceptualized forgiveness as the healing process. And it's not. It's a part of it for you, but in fooling yourself into thinking, well, I can just tell myself that I'm going to forgive them, or I'm going to forgive this person or myself or whatever it is, and now I'm suddenly free of everything that came with it. It's you're not. This is a step. It's usually the final step for most people.
Okay, I was going to say, what step is that? Is it the final step? Of course, it's going to differ.
Yeah, it's going to differ. But for example, when you've been hurt by somebody, there's a space and a time to not forgive, to acknowledge the feelings, the pain, the hurt, the trauma that's been inflicted or experienced. Before I can get to a space where I can forgive this and move past it, I need to acknowledge the hurt, the pain, the wrongdoing, whatever it was that has occurred, and then start to address how am I dealing with those things? What does my life look like? Because it might redefine who I am. We talked about in our last episode where we were going over the question about infidelity. One of the concepts that I brought up was a couple, when they experience infidelity, oftentimes what happens is it's not just a trust issue. It becomes a crisis of identity. When I thought I knew who we were, I thought I knew who you were, I thought I knew who I was, right? And now that's all gone. So forgiveness doesn't just I can forgive you for your indiscretion or for the mistake that you made or for whatever reasons it was that you stepped out on me. But none of that answers, my forgiveness doesn't answer those new questions. Who are you? Who are we? Who am I? Where are we going? What does our future actually look like? It doesn't address that part of it. And so it's not the whole thing, but it is a part of that process. And so you might get to a space where forgiveness might be, and here's the other part that I want to warrant people on. Forgiveness for some people is a very easy process. They don't struggle with this. For some people, it is a very laborious process. This is difficult to do because it's kind of like, you know how we live in a world that we really want it to be fair? Well, like, I hurt you, which is bad for you, and now you have to forgive me, right? So you get dinged twice in order to feel free of the pain. And if the other person doesn't at least even acknowledge what they've done, now you're stuck with the whole ball of wax. You're like, I got hurt and I get to forgive. Like, this sucks. You know, this is not a fun situation to be in.
I don't want to be the bigger person. This is terrible.
It is terrible.
But would you agree that if you don't forgive somebody, even if like it's not, even if they're not receptive to it, right? Like if you continue to hold that, like, again, resentment, anger, whatever negative emotion that you've labeled to it, don't you think that that will still affect you negatively?
Yes.
Okay.
Denial of forgiveness keeps you connected to the pain.
Yes.
An inability to let go of the person or the situation or the experience that caused it. Forgiveness is a step in that process. And if you deny that step, you consciously or subconsciously keep yourself connected to the trauma, the hurtful emotions, the negative experiences, the bad person in your life, the evil, whatever it is. And it doesn't allow you to progress forward completely in a healthy way. It doesn't allow you to incorporate it into yourself, into becoming a whole person. You keep a part of yourself hidden and hurt and broken, and you keep connected to it, which is also why some people don't forgive. They want to stay connected to that person. They want to stay connected to the trauma. They need it maybe to help define who they are or their experiences or justify their anger or their emotions, right? And so there's a time and a space to process those emotions. And this, again, I'm speaking about this in like a complete whole therapeutic sense, which is why it's a little bit more detailed and why I wanted to address it in a slightly longer length podcast, because it's not as simple as just saying like, okay, they hurt my feelings and I'm going to forgive them. I feel better. You know, it's not that simple. And so I really kind of want to get into it, but I really want the concept to come across that denial of forgiveness just keeps you connected to the pain. And so that's an important...
I think everybody's probably experienced that too.
Everybody has.
And like you said, as terrible as it is, sometimes you do that because you want to stay connected. Mm-hmm. Like, you know that you shouldn't, but you continue to relive that, or like relive the conversation or the situation, or like, if this would have happened this way, mm-hmm. right? Like, how often do
that bargaining that occurs, that negotiating?
Like that like fake conversation, you're like washing your hair and you're like, well, this time, and it's like, okay, the shampoo bottles are like, bro, we've heard this 15 times. Like, just stop, just give it up. It's not going to happen. You're not going to get it. And that's, I think, what's hard is, you know, because like you said, some people are, whether they don't want to acknowledge the pain that they've caused, or they don't want to just deal with those emotions, mm-hmm. and they just shut the other person out, and you're not going to ever hear that from them. And like, we naturally, I think, most people want closure, you know, especially if you're the person who was hurt. Mm-hmm. So you're like, how unfair is this that I'm not going to get that? But sometimes you're just not, because of that individual, or like the place that person's in, or like what they're dealing with. Like, you don't really know.
They may be dead. And they might not even be able to possess the ability to forgive.
There we go. Of course. I was trying to keep it, kind of casual. But yes, if somebody's dead, you're definitely not going to get the closure that you wanted. And that's pretty morbid, but also it's not. And it's true, because there's a lot of people who are dealing with that situation, mm-hmm. which is certainly the most extreme of these examples. Mm-hmm. But even if somebody isn't dead, even if somebody is alive and they're not going to give that to you, you have to decide to move mm-hmm. forward from that, because otherwise you are keeping yourself attached and you're not going to move past it.
Agreed, 100%. So I guess one thing I want to start with is, actually I'll start on the back side of this. I really want to kind of get into like 3 basic categories of forgiveness. And these aren't like official definitions. These are kind of the ones that I've developed over the years. So one of the first ones I want to talk about is what I call vicarious forgiveness. And vicarious forgiveness is when you have hurt the ones that I love. Okay. So, for example,
I'm like, give me an example.
Okay. When my dad hurts my mom.
Okay.
Right. My mom is somebody that I love. The offense isn't actually happening to me. It's happened to somebody that I love. Right. But I am angry toward dad or stepdad or the neighbor across the street who hurt my sister or my brother or something like that, or my sister's boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever it is that dumped them or hurt them in some way. I'm angry at that person, even though the pain wasn't directly inflicted to me. I still feel pain. It's just different. And so I kind of have lumped that into like what I call vicarious forgiveness, the ability to forgive somebody who hasn't directly harmed you, but has harmed the people that you love. Victims of, we call them secondary victims of the offense itself, right? So kind of vicarious. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now it does.
Okay. And then there's kind of like primary forgiveness, which is you have directly hurt me. Like I am the person that you specifically hurt. I'm the person you lied to, that you betrayed, that you cheated on, whatever it was. I'm the person that you did that to, so it is primary to me. And then here's the other side of the forgiveness coin. We're talking about when you mentioned earlier, I think you mentioned self-forgiveness. And this is the concept of forgiving yourself when you've been the one who has wronged other people. And this is a tricky concept, right? Because I think self-forgiveness is a wonderful and necessary component of life and of healing. It falls very much in line with what we were talking about last week with the Young podcast, which is like truly integrating yourself and understanding the conscious and subconscious motives and understanding the aspects of who you are that you don't like. And so there's times where we have to admit, or we want to admit, that I am capable of hurting other people, that I have done wrong in somebody else's life, that I didn't do right by them. And those times can be incredibly difficult. They can be painful because we create, in many ways, a facade of what we want to be, that persona that exists that we project to the world that isn't necessarily our authentic self. And so this kind of forces you to confront the parts of you that have hurt other people when you've done wrong and been the person who has caused pain in somebody else's life. And so it's very easy for people to use this tool as a way to avoid the vulnerability that comes with acknowledging those things and to experiencing what you could experience to process and heal and grow. So it's one that we want to kind of handle carefully, but is very necessary.
Meaning that if somebody could use this as a way to kind of write off their behavior and not really deal with it, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
As soon as you said that, I was like, well, this could definitely be taken down that route as well. Especially if somebody has certain, obviously, like personality traits and different things, and you could be like, oh, well, I forgive myself, and then it's like, okay, well, you didn't examine your behavior, and are you going to do that again? You know, forgiveness is not just, and not saying that nobody can ever make a mistake again, but if you start to develop patterns, it's like that's what we want to hopefully avoid, especially if it is something that is really harmful to other people. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know, right? You don't know that you're harming someone until it's done, and you don't really realize whatever's going on. But I could definitely see this becoming kind of like one of those manipulative things. Like, yeah, no, I've forgiven myself.
I forgave myself a long time ago for that. It's like,
really?
How did you forgive yourself? Yeah. Like, what did you do?
What did you do to grow,
to learn
past that? Yeah, and learn from the experience so we don't do it again.
Yeah, and I'll address some of that, and I think it can actually utilize parts of my own personal life because we're talking about the self in that. But a concept that I want to talk about that follows very closely with forgiveness is the concept of unconditional self-acceptance, unconditional acceptance of others, and unconditional acceptance of the world. So now what does that mean? Well, each one is very similar in nature. So unconditional self basically means acknowledging and understanding that I am a human being, I'm fallible, I make mistakes, right? I want to learn and forgive myself and accept myself and move forward. And I say accept myself because I'm accepting the parts of me that are broken, the parts of me that are bad. It doesn't mean that I have to allow those things to define me. I'm just incorporating them. I'm accepting that this is a part of who I am, and I'm going to move forward. But I'm going to learn from these experiences. And if I can accept myself, then the next step is learning to accept other people as the same part of that process. You are a human being. The person who wronged me is fallible. They make mistakes, right? I want to work to forgive them, to accept them, and move forward. And understanding unconditional acceptance of the world as it exists. The world is a good place and a bad place. The world is a fair place and an unfair place. I still want to work to accept it and move forward because forgiveness is not a black and white issue. It's not fair or unfair. And many times forgiveness is an unfair process to the person who's been hurt, especially if the person who has hurt them is unwilling to or unable to acknowledge their wrongdoing for whatever the circumstances might be. Maybe they're like a raging narcissist and refuse to admit that they were wrong or that they hurt you. Maybe the person's no longer with us, and so they can't acknowledge those things. But this borders along, again, what we talked about before with understanding that the stronger, larger concepts that are at play when we're talking about the development of human beings and our personalities and who we are. And I think when we can start to acknowledge these pieces in other people that exist as well as them existing within ourselves, it becomes an easier process to forgive them. When I can see myself in somebody else's actions, it becomes much easier to forgive, because we all want to be forgiven for what we've done or who we are. But I don't want to judge other people for things that I myself am capable of doing. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And I think that I think everybody has a time in their life where, or maybe a few times, where this really like hits you in the face, right? Where you're thinking like, I would never do this. And maybe even something that you had judged other people for previously, right?
Yeah.
And then you find yourself in that exact situation and you're like, holy shit, I am just as flawed and capable of these things. And I can see how easy this is. And now, again, these are, like within reason, right? Like, of course, like we're talking about things that are within reason. You have to recognize that in other people. And I think I don't even know, the older you get, the more experiences you have, the more situations you encounter, or really the more open-minded you are to these things, right? Because I guess you could be older and have a lot of experiences and not necessarily recognize this, right? But I think that if you're open to it and you start to recognize this, you can see like, wow, okay, I was maybe very judgmental before. And this is something that I've talked about, in general, but like my default is to be somebody, I'm very black and white, very judgmental. I'm very like, and it's not a good quality. I'm not saying that it's a good quality. And sometimes things do need to be judged, right? And there is certainly a time and a place to be judged, yourself, others, certainly, but like within reason, and probably way less than all of us do. And as I've learned or tried to become more of an open and understanding person, I realize like, all right, like you really don't know. First of all, you don't know what somebody is going through. Mm-hmm. You don't know what they have gone through, that their current actions are probably being driven by something that happened before in their life, right? Now they're just kind of acting that out. And you also don't realize what you would do in that situation either, right? Until you've been there. And I think that that's one of those things that you have to really like, put yourself in somebody's shoes, but like literally that is so important. And I think as I started to be able to recognize that, I've become less judgmental of situations, right? And because ultimately you really don't know how you would respond to something until you're there. And who am I to say anything, because I'm not in that spot, right? And you can want to live a certain way and hold yourself to a certain standard, but the only standard that you can hold is to yourself. You can't hold that to anybody else. And we can wish and hope and want all we want, you know what I mean? But there's certain things that, and this is like big and small things, right? Like it doesn't, somebody was telling me, oh, I'm going out to eat with someone, and the person wasn't even like considerate to like the other person, right? Like it was just something that like, it was so small and so minute, it did not matter at all. But I'm like, I would just never do that. And she was like, yeah, neither would I. Like we're just not like that. And it doesn't matter. It was like not a big deal, but it's just little things like, how could somebody do that? Or why would you just say that? Literally such a small, meaningless example, but it's like, not everybody thinks the way that you do. Not everybody has the experiences that you have. And also thinking back on your past self, like I think about myself 3 years ago and I'm like, oh my gosh, like mortified. And even going back even farther than that, what I mean? Like, oh my gosh, how was I acting? Like, I don't say this in a way like I'm a totally different person, because it's not that who I am is totally different, but I am much different than I used to be. And I say that in like a really good way, because it's like, okay, there's a lot of growth there and there's change, and I'm hopefully acting differently and hopefully better. So I think that sometimes like
more complete.
Yeah, more complete. I guess we could say that. It's a good word. I'll go with it. Rick said I'm more complete. He's like, no, you're not. I'm just saying.
I said more. More being the operative word there. Kind of following back in line with some of those questions. What are you forgiving? What is the purpose of your forgiveness, and why do we forgive? So I think I want to clear up some myths surrounding forgiveness. First of all, I think people are quick to try and provide an explanation for why we should forgive. Like, for example, forgiveness means doing the right thing, right? It's kind of
the right thing.
To do the right thing, right? And so what's underneath that? You're basically saying, well, by doing the right thing, I'm the right person. I'm a good person, right, for doing this. And it doesn't necessarily pan out that way. It's not about doing the right thing doesn't necessarily make you feel better about the situation. It doesn't help heal you. It doesn't help expedite the growth process or the learning process or the meaning from it. In fact, by saying I'm going to do this because I'm a good person is actually a way of repressing what it is that you're actually feeling. Huh?
Because that's like, seems almost like a cop-out of actually dealing with the emotions. But because also like, what is the right way? What is the good way? Like how you define that is going to be different person to person. Because you like that person could be like, no, I'm a good person. I'm doing the right thing. But like their definition of that is wildly different than the other person. It's kind of like when we did talk about this on the cheating podcast, like, what is cheating, right? Like, you have to define that, because that definition could vary person to person. And that doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. It's just, it's going to vary. So when you say something like blanket statement, like, I'm a good person, I'm going to do this because, like, well, what does that even mean?
Well, it's
Can
almost,
you define this?
Yeah. And in doing that, you're taking a path of righteousness that places you above this person. Like, I'm a good person. It's my duty to forgive them. And so now it's like, wait a minute, we're not acknowledging what's happened here. You're placing yourself in a superior position to deflect from the hurt emotions and from processing it. Now, like I said, sometimes forgiveness is an easy thing for some people, and they don't really have to think about it because they can move on very quickly and easily, and hey, more power to them. Like, I can't hate for people who it's just easy for them to do stuff. You ever have that friend in school who was like, yeah, I can do math, no problem. And they just like could sit down and understood everything. And I was like, oh, I hate you. Like, I need to figure this out. I hate you. And it's a struggle. But for some people, forgiveness is just that process. It's an easy thing. But to think that you're doing this just from a space because it's the right thing to do, it's the wrong thing to do it from. Number 2, another myth is you get a lot of pressure to forgive from other people. Forgiveness is wrapped up in family, in culture, in philosophy, in political posturing, in religious beliefs. One of my favorites is it's to forgive is the Christian thing to do. And it's like, okay, wait a minute now. Am I supposed to forgive this person because I'm a Christian, right? That's my duty to forgive them. But is that really acknowledging all the other things that kind of happened and everything that's developed as a result of that? And so am I being pressured to forgive this person because it's my duty based off of my religion or my family or my culture or my political affiliation? Or am I forgiving this person because it's the right thing to do for me? And so I think sometimes the influences that come, and a lot of times what I find is people will put pressure to help other people forgive because it helps them avoid the vulnerable space that they feel in dealing with somebody else's issues or trauma, right? I might push you. I'd be like, Lauren, this happened to you, but you need to forgive them. Why? Because I don't like the space that it's making me feel, the vulnerability that it creates in me. And so I'll push you to forgive them.
Bringing up past memories of maybe when you didn't forgive.
Yeah. Or perhaps the judgment that comes with that. Right.
There we go.
There you go.
To use another buzzword. Well, that's not really a buzzword. It's a real word, but go back to our Jung podcast if you didn't listen to it. And more than 2.5 people did listen.
I guess so, yeah. We're creeping up on, 1,000 views over?
The YouTube was off and popping. Everybody hates me. All good. But outside of that, no, I did actually get a lot of messages from people. Like, good. Oh, I really liked that. And I was like, okay. They're like, there's more people listening. And I'm like, perfect.
Yeah, I told you my friend Phil texted me. Phil. Great guy. He subscribes to the podcast. So.
Hey, thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Phil.
If you're listening. Appreciate you.
Shout out to Phil. Okay, so the right thing to do, pressure to forgive from other people, and then to kind of dip back into something we talked about before. One of the other myths is that forgiveness is a shortcut to healing, or forgiveness is the healing process, and it's not. It is not the process that will heal you. It won't, because the hurt is still there. It exists. And so I think we need to kind of conceptualize what we're doing. And by the way, for those of you that are listening, I'm going to give you some concrete steps to do, things to kind of follow, to help you in this process toward the end of the podcast. So one thing that I do want to talk about is saying I forgive you is not the same thing as actually forgiving. So saying is not doing here. Like, we tell ourselves, we tell our friends, we tell the world necessarily.
I'm over it.
Yeah. I forgave him a long time ago, or I forgive her, or, and that's not it. It's not just saying the words, I forgive you. That's not the healing process. That's not forgiveness, really. That's, for most people, it's putting a mask of denial on top of it and just kind of refusing to deal with what's hurt. And so I think what I want people to understand too is this: forgiveness is a process. It is not, for many people, a one-time endeavor. This isn't like I spent some time in therapy or really reflective time, like thinking, analyzing, interpreting, and kind of processing through this myself. You don't need to do it with a therapist. You can. It can help, obviously. But it's not just something that you can come to the conclusion to sometimes and say, all right, I've gotten to the space where I want to forgive them, because things will trigger it. Memories will come up. Emotions might still pop up. And so forgiveness can sometimes be a repeated process that occurs many times over the same situation with the same person over the same experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And that's why it's so hard. It's like when things come up, it's almost like this test, and you're like, oh, I'm totally past this, right? And you think you are. And then something comes up, like you said, like a memory or an interaction or something. And then you're like, nope, still here. but that it is a process. And I think that depending on, I would say probably what you're forgiving somebody over is, like the magnitude of it is certainly going to impact how long that takes, but also the person, right? Because some people feel things a lot more than others. Some people forgive, like you said, really easily. Other people take a really long time. We all know that person who's held a grudge for like their whole life over something, you know what I mean? And again, can't judge it because we don't know all the other circumstances, but there are certainly people who are going to be able to get through things faster. And so it's not always what the situation would be, I would imagine, but that probably does have a large role, right? Like there's no way that we can say that the magnitude of what you're forgiving somebody over doesn't have a role in the healing process as far as like the timeline.
Right.
Something really bad happens to you. It's like, hey, it's okay that you didn't get over it in like 2 days. Like it's going to take some time, and that's all right. And that process is going to look different for each person, but continuously pushing yourself to move forward in that growth process, kind of like anything that we talk about, right? Like understanding and not pushing yourself to have a certain timeline is really important, but also making sure that you're not just wallowing in that kind of like limbo place and you actually are taking steps forward, because otherwise you're never really going to close that loop.
Right.
And then that's just as detrimental to be like, no, I'm still working on it. And it's like, okay, well, at some point though, how are we going to move forward? Well,
and part of how we're going to move forward is stuff that we've talked about in the past too, right? For example, going back to logotherapy or existentialism, Viktor Frankl kind of stuff, right? Define meaning in the suffering. So what you experienced is suffering, is pain. Part of the healing process is like, it's not just pushing it away and saying, I forgive this person, I'm moving past it in 2 days. Part of the process is defining, what did this experience mean to me? What does it teach me? How can I grow from this? What am I learning in this process? Not only about this other person, but about myself. And here's the other part. What part of myself did I play, or did potentially I play in this role? Sometimes, and I'm not going to like try and scapegoat this at all, sometimes we are 100% the victim and it is not your fault. Other times you do play a dynamic in the relationship or in the situation that occurred. And even though you were the one that got hurt, it doesn't necessarily mean that you weren't involved, that you didn't have a role or responsibility in that. And that's, again, I'm not blaming you, but I'm saying these are the things that we want to start to explore, not just push it off the table because I'm forgiving the person and I'm so super cool and great and good and they're bad and I'm feeling, and I'm a Christian, right? And this is my duty. It's my duty to forgive somebody, right? You see the pressure. Now I'm suppressing who I naturally am and what I really want to say, my authentic self, all of these things. Instead, I want to encourage all that to come out. But you can learn in this process. What meaning and purpose and value did this provide? And sometimes that perspective isn't given to us right away. So the idea of you need to get over this right away is like a total myth. And it's harmful to the individual because it's robbing them of the opportunity to find meaning and value in this experience for themselves and to kind of catalog it in their memories and to store it as like, okay, now I know why this existed. I know what happened. I know what I learned from it. Now I can reflect on it and use it as a tool in my arsenal to deal with other issues or problems that are going to develop. Is that?
Yeah. And I think that takes a while in and of itself to develop. Like that's not something that I feel like I was able to even do until recently. Like, okay, see actually the role that I played, see what out of something that really negative could have happened, what is a positive here? Like, what did I learn? How can I use that moving forward? And I think the reason is for a lot of people, and maybe I'm just speaking from my experience, but not giving yourself that space and that time to actually reflect on it and just kind of pushing it away, right? For people who identify with that, it's just kind of like push things away, stuff them down. That is that's a really easy way to get over things and to move forward, but you're not really moving forward. No. And you're also not really learning anything from it. And people would say, well, how do you learn something from a really horrible experience? There's probably something that you can glean from that. It might be very small, right? But there's still something, or at least you can say, I can use this moving forward, and I can spot these signs, or I can, I recognize that I like this in a person, or I don't like that, or I don't want to act this way. It could even be that, like, wow, the way that somebody treated me here, like, I don't want to act like that towards anybody else. So I'm glad that I saw what that looked like, because I could have easily done that and not recognized it. But I think that just creating that space to, like you said, reflect and just be really introspective of the role that not only you played, but just what that meant in general. And sometimes that just takes a while to really synthesize, because it's not like a quick, some people process things really quickly, but when there's like hurt and pain and something that we need to forgive somebody or ourselves for, it's probably going to take a little bit longer.
Yeah. It's kind of like if there's a fire happening inside your house, you're not going to sit back and analyze why it started.
This is fine.
This is fine. Yeah. Thomas the Train. You're not going to sit back and think, while the flames are roaring in your kitchen, why is this fire happening? Like, what is this fire going to teach me? What's the meaning of this fire? You need to put the fucking fire out before you can address
what does this mean?
All the other stuff that goes along with it, right? And there's a rebuilding process that occurs, and it's analyzing the details and understanding it, and then you can make sense of it when the crisis isn't occurring. But sometimes that fire that's occurring is the emotional pain and consequences that we're feeling in that moment, and you can't extinguish that right away. It's not something that we're just able to suddenly just say, nope, I don't want to feel bad anymore, so I'm not going to feel bad or angry or upset or depressed or anxious. Like, if that was the case, I wouldn't have a job and no one would need therapy, and we wouldn't be talking.
And there would be no negative emotion then.
Correct.
Which also, it does serve a purpose, because I think that when there is the negative emotions, which that could be a whole different topic, but feeling those negative emotions allows you to, I think, really see the positives in other things, right? Because until you felt that depth of negativity, it's really hard to appreciate the positives.
Correct. Yeah. And so one of the first things I'll ask people is, when we're starting on the process of going through forgiveness and they're struggling with, I don't want to forgive this person. It's like, okay, so I want to start to explore that with you, the individual listener, the person who's in therapy or talking, whatever it is. And I want you to say, okay, if we don't forgive them, why don't you want to forgive them? Like, what's keeping you from forgiving them? And oftentimes what you'll hear immediately following that is the real reason that people don't want to forgive. And this is where it tells us we need to start the work. I don't want to forgive him because he hurt me. He lied to me. I'm angry. I'm pissed off. I'm depressed. I'm sad. I've been betrayed. It's like, okay, good. You don't want to forgive him right now because you're experiencing these things. Let's put forgiveness to the side. Let's talk about the betrayal. Let's talk about your anger and what's causing your anger and what's underneath your anger and your depression and your sadness and your loneliness and that sense of betrayal and the loss of who you are and who you were and where you're going in life. Let's talk about that. Now we're on the road to heal. I'm getting a clear understanding of what this means to you and what this means in your life and its perspective. Now, that perspective will be very important later on when all of these emotions have slowly started to fade, because emotions are temporary. They don't sustain forever. What you feel today, you won't necessarily feel as intense tomorrow or a month from now or 3 months from now or a year from now. It can take a while, but I promise you the intensity will drop and they won't sustain. But now we're dealing with, what are the root causes? What's underneath your reasons to not want to forgive them, right? In denying them that forgiveness, we're still acknowledging the pain that is existing. It's okay for that pain to be there. It's a byproduct of what happened. Let's acknowledge that. Let's start to move through that. And so I think also a really important step is understanding too that, especially when it kind of falls in line with that vicarious trauma that I was talking about, when you've hurt other people that I care about, is acknowledging that what you're feeling in relationship to what that person went through, right? So if my stepdad hits my mom, I'm not the direct victim of my mother's abuse. I'm the indirect victim. I'm that vicarious person. But so while my mom has the black eye, I'm not necessarily forgiving the black eye. I want and need forgiveness for what I'm feeling. You made me feel scared, alone, unsafe, etc. Whatever the adjective is that you want to use to describe your emotions in that space. That's what I'm working to forgive. How you made me feel in that situation with other people. I can't own what you did to my mom. I need to own what I feel as a result of the experience. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Obviously, the primary forgiveness would be focusing on what hurt and specifically was done to you. And then self-forgiveness, which this is the tricky one for a lot of people, as long as we're not using it for a scapegoat, it becomes a kind of staple for you as a person to acknowledge a more real, authentic version of yourself. And can you admit and take responsibility for what you've done. And this to me is a difficult process for myself personally, the self-forgiveness part. It's easy for me through my life experiences. It wasn't always easy to forgive people in my life. The people who have hurt me or wronged me. It was a very long, painful process. Unfortunately, it was long and painful. However, fortunately, now I've gotten to a space where, based off of those experiences, I don't deny other people forgiveness. And it's actually rather easy for me to forgive people at this point because of what I've learned and what I've experienced and how I'm able to process it. Because I can see myself in almost every action now, I've learned that it's an easier process for me to forgive that person. However, the self-forgiveness part, when I've wronged other people or not done right by them, that's the part that's more challenging. And so people will ask, well, what's the way to ensure that if you're forgiving yourself, you're just not letting yourself off the hook for all the bad shit that you've done? And so this is where the only advice I can give is the advice that I follow in this particular situation. And that is, number one, if I can acknowledge my wrongdoing, right? If I can at least report back to the other person that I've heard what they're saying and that I know what I did has hurt them. And it wasn't my intention, but people don't give a shit about your intentions when they're hurt. They're just hurt. And so I need to acknowledge that space for them. And I need to acknowledge it for myself. I need to have that come to Jesus kind of moment and realize and recognize that, hey, despite as great as you thought you were, you're still all of these things, and these things are still a part of you. You possess the ability to help people and hurt people. You possess the ability to influence and motivate, and you possess the ability to hurt or destruct. It's just a byproduct of being a human being. But when I say that I'm sorry to somebody, the objective becomes, how do I incorporate this into my life? Because you don't learn necessarily from your victories in life. You learn more from your defeats. And I consider them to be not necessarily defeats, but ultimate learning lessons into shaping who I'm supposed to become. And I realized along that process, even very recently in my life, I'm still on that path. I'm not there yet. But what I try and do is I say to myself, okay, I've acknowledged this, and maybe this person's not a part of my life anymore. So I need to ask myself, what did I need to learn? What do I need to do to make sure that I don't repeat these same things, that these same patterns and behaviors don't manifest themselves again? That even if this person isn't here and never knows or acknowledges it, that I know, because sooner or later, these same experiences will manifest. They might not be exactly the same, but they'll pop up again and they'll be there. And so it's your ability to kind of recognize it and adjust and say, okay, I'm going to do this. I have learned from that past experience. And it's kind of like you're paying homage to it. You know, you're giving it honor, so to speak, by saying, all right, this occurred. And so it's kind of like a ripple effect. If I hurt one person but don't learn from it, I'm bound to repeat that 2 or 5 times or 10 times or 20 times. And so that hurt expands. But if in hurting one person, I've learned from it and I can avoid that ripple effect that occurs, well, now it doesn't affect 20 other people. It still hurt that one person, but that one experience has taught me how to shape my life and how to live in a more authentic way that I want to live my life and who I want to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I feel like for you personally, it's probably harder because, you know, you have all this information about, like, you understand everything, right? Like from a psychological perspective, right? So that's probably adds to that layer. People who are maybe in your position feel that even harder, right? Like the self, you know, like, oh, I should have known this because I know these steps, like whatever. I can see how that would be more challenging. And probably just certain people probably are harder on themselves in this situation than others, you know, like the self-forgiveness. And I would imagine that there's, you know, some people, they're going to be two extremes. There's going to be people who are so hard on themselves. And then in that instance, it's not like they're even really learning from it, right? Like they're being a martyr for their cause, but like now you're not able to take away that lesson and that experience. And then on the other side of it, there's sometimes people who are just like, yeah, I forgave myself. And then now you're becoming like pathological with what you're doing. So there's two sides to that. So that in between part is what is really probably the most useful place to get to. And again, all of this is about recognizing you and your capacity and like where you fall here, and there's no like right or wrong, but understanding, where you are. Okay, are you somebody who is quick to forgive? Are you somebody who is really slow to forgive? Are you somebody who learns the positive lessons, or do you only focus on the negatives when you're in these bad situations? So I think just this podcast hopefully is getting people to reflect on those types of things, because I think that's the start of it, is like actually understanding how do I operate in this system? Because I think a lot of this is subconscious to some degree. A lot of us aren't necessarily thinking about this, or we just think, yeah, I forgave them, or just time will pass and it'll go on. But there are certain things that are obviously a lot more severe than others that do need to be dealt with in this way. And like I said, I think we all know those people who just are super bitter and resentful, and those things kind of compound. They have a few bad things happen to them and they never really learn from it, and they never really reflect or take any kind of ownership. And again, not saying that it was necessarily their fault, but they don't see any of their role there. And then those people, again, we can all know that person, that old person who's just so grumpy and always has a story about how everybody wronged them and this and that. And it's like, that's no way to live either, because you could have been wronged by all of those people. But how did you use that moving forward? You only took those negatives. You never moved past it. You held on to this resentment. And now you're this really awful, bitter person who every interaction you have with somebody is tainted by that. And it's so awful to see. It's just sad. It's just like sad to see it, because what that person's going through. And it's just completely all this unresolved lack of forgiveness for themselves or towards others, or really understanding maybe where somebody else was in that position.
And I think a lot of times what happens is when we hurt somebody, the initial reaction that we have is obviously our ego gets hurt, right? And we tend to think, well, the person hurt me and I don't matter to them. They don't care about me. And so we internalize that specific behavior as this kind of like rejection of who we are. It's like they clearly didn't care. They don't like me. They don't love me. They don't care about me. And so the idea becomes, once you've acknowledged that what you've done is actually wrong, and you make significant changes to ensure that it doesn't happen again, to me, it's the only way. And again, even if the person never knows it, that by me making these changes, I'm demonstrating to you that you did matter, that this situation mattered, that it was important to me, that even if I was right or wrong, that mattered to me too. And I'm changing this so that it doesn't happen again. I can't erase the past, but I can certainly make sure that the future doesn't have that same issue or mistake or pain inflicted by me. And so by making the changes, what you're telling that person is, you did matter. I do care about you, or I do have a sense of what it meant to hurt you. And so I'm going to move forward, not hurting myself and beating myself up all the time about it, but acknowledging, okay, I can do better and I will do better in this, but you did matter to me. And it's not that I don't care about you. It's just that I'm learning to address what caused this so that it doesn't happen again.
What if you're on the other side of that? What if you are the person who feels wronged and like you didn't matter, and the other person is not acknowledging that? And they may never acknowledge that because they've just either erased it, or they don't think that they're in the wrong, or they're emotionless, like whatever the reason is. Like, sure. How would you, as that individual on that side, forgive that person?
Okay, good question. And this is going to kind of lead into the steps of forgiveness that I wanted to address. Sometimes people are unwilling or unable to forgive you, to give you that acknowledgement or that feedback for whatever the reason, and it doesn't matter. So now it certainly makes the climb a little bit harder. I'm not going to deny that aspect, like it does. It's just a bigger pill to swallow. And so number one, what we want to do is recognize and accept that I can want this. All that I want is for this person to acknowledge it, but they're not going to. So getting to a space where I can accept that limitation is important. But first and foremost, number one, acknowledge what they've done specifically, period. Acknowledge it. Why am I searching to forgive you? What is it that you did to me specifically? And I want you to state that out loud. Then I want you to state, why is it wrong? Or state that it was wrong. What you did isn't right. It is wrong for these reasons. It hurt me in these ways. It did this to me. It made me feel this way. Then 3, understand that the person you're hating or loathing or feeling negatively about is more than just their behavior. And this is where you start to see the individual more than just the act. Because I think what happens is when somebody does something to us that offends us or hurts us, we define the entire person by this one act. We see them as evil or as wrong or as bad, and they're just this one thing. And it's like you said earlier, you don't know what happened to that person. You don't know their life story or their circumstances. And I'm not saying that to you to elicit empathy and have this space for them where it forgives them of all their wrongdoing. But what it does do is it's like, okay, if I can remove just this one behavior, or not even remove it, keep it, but acknowledge all the other things that contribute to you as a human being, I start to see a little bit more of a complete picture. And I recognize that this person made a mistake, that this person, maybe it's not even about me. It's just about who that person is, or this is a byproduct of who they are in this moment and in this space and in this time. And with these pressures and these anxieties and these things happening. And I can forgive that a lot more than I can you being the representation of pure evil in my life. And that you're the sum of all bad things that have happened in this world. And if I can look past just that one behavior and recognize you as a whole person, it becomes an easier process to forgive. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Second thing, or actually this would be like kind of the fourth step, is
like,
to...
oh, you're never so off.
is to start to break the connection between you and the pain, or you and them, right? And sometimes we can forgive people and keep them in our lives. Other times we need to forgive them and not have them in our lives. And that's okay too. That's a part of saying, this is my boundary, and I need to create that boundary for whatever my reasons are. But I don't want to be connected to this anymore. And that's what forgiveness is. It's the freedom from the pain that comes with it. In order to get to that space, we need to do the work to get there, though, right? But in saying I forgive you, or in forgiving this person through that process, I'm breaking the trauma bond. I'm breaking the link. I'm breaking the process, because when I don't forgive, it keeps me connected to the pain. And so I'm simply saying, I don't want to carry you around with me anymore, or I don't want to carry this experience around with me anymore. If I can keep the person in my life, great. I can do that and move forward, and maybe I need to create better boundaries or understand the expectations and not put myself in vulnerable spaces with this person anymore. But you're breaking the connection, and you've got to say to yourself, it's that process of, I don't want to be connected to this anymore. I want to move past this. I'm looking into my future now. And then
those are like this. Sometimes, like you said, it's like the physical space, and sometimes it's those conversations,
mm-hmm.
like again, like the what ifs, and that I would say this, or I would like to do that, or I wish it was this way. Like all of those things, as soon as, I think anybody can relate to that. Like when you start to feel those that way, you literally start to feel like a negative
mm-hmm.
kind of wave come over you, like negative emotions, like the kind of physical side of that. As soon as you start to feel that, or as soon as you start to go through those thoughts, like you have to stop that, because that's keeping you just as connected as seeing the person, just kind of reliving that, or reliving the memories or the conversations that you want to have or didn't have, or whatever it is. And like I think that's almost even harder,
mm-hmm.
because like you can not see someone or not see their stuff, whatever it is, or take yourself away from a physical location. But it's those things that like replay over and over again, when you're in the shower, you're trying to go to bed, or really whenever. And like that is what you have to try and stop I think that's probably the hardest part. And that's not just going to be like, oh yeah, I did this one day, I heard it on a podcast, I'll just stop these negative thoughts. But it's like, you have to actively do that, or actively start to think about something else, and not to push it away, because there is a point of just hearing those thoughts and then just suppressing them.
Mm-hmm.
So you do need to feel it, but you don't need to just have them spiraling in the background, because that is, or replaying in the background, because that is what will create that spiral.
Yeah. And are you spiraling with purpose? Like, are you spiraling to get to a deeper understanding and a meaning in it that helps you classify it and put it in its place? Great. If you're just repeating the arguments over and over and over in your head, you're staying connected to it, and denying that forgiveness keeps you connected to that person. And maybe you still want to be connected to them for whatever those reasons are. You can explore those reasons, but you're denying the ability to move forward in a healthy way. And I always have found that when people stop conversing with themselves in those ways, which clearly we know Lauren does in the shower now, because you've made reference that this is when you go through all your mental...
I feel like this is a very normal thing. It's almost like a joke at this point, like the shower, like, like you see those memes, and it's like the shower bottles like applauding after my argument, and like all that stuff.
You're head and shoulders above everyone else.
Oh my God. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. And
great humor.
So great.
Dad
joke central.
Yeah. So, I argue in the car with myself. That's the time that I do it. But you enjoy the shower. Go ahead.
No, the car is a good place. I feel like the car, like there's something about just driving. I never used to feel like this until recently. Maybe just because I'm noticing things more. But like there's something about the movement like past your eyes, and it's very just kind of like meditative almost. I mean, of course you're like paying attention to the road, but so there's some times where you can't really. But I would say that long car rides are definitely another time.
And then to kind of wrap up, the fifth step would be to look to heal yourself and understand that you can heal yourself and you no longer need anything from that person, right? Whatever it was that person was fulfilling for you, you don't need them in your life. You wanted them. You had very specific reasons and expectations and ambitions. But the process becomes by disconnecting emotionally from that space and from that pain. It means I no longer have to ask you to fulfill this part of me. I can heal myself, and I don't need that from you. And again, this can be done keeping people in your life. This doesn't mean I have to disconnect and push everybody out of my life. Sometimes you need to make that decision, and that's a personal decision for each individual to make. But this process is just simply working through the hurt and pain, because sometimes you're not going to get rid of it. Like you might decide, all right, I'm going to work through my infidelity and I'm going to stay married to my husband or my wife. And so you're not going to get rid of this person, but this is a process that you go through in order to heal. And so I guess I want you to remember, if there's one phrase to take with you, is that forgiveness isn't necessarily healing. It's freedom from the pain and the hurt. And it can create the space for peace that you need to move forward. But it is not the healing process itself. And so I hope that this provided some level of insight for people, when it comes to forgiveness. And it's fairly more complicated than what it seems. And it's not just something that we can just say, hey, I forgive and move on. And I don't want to, fall into those myths or those traps of doing it for other people, or doing it because I think I'm a good person, or that it's my duty to do, and start on that process of really starting to look at not the behavior, but the whole person. And I think when you can do that, forgiveness starts to open up doors, and it is a relief to no longer carry that burden with you.
It really is a burden, especially if you're just holding on to that negative emotion, and, that other person has moved on and you're like, man, here I am still, right? And that's definitely where this is super important. And this gave me a lot of things to think about, and I'm sure everybody else listening feels the exact same way. And this is not a linear process. It's going to take a lot of time, but this is something that literally impacts almost every aspect of our lives, whether, just kind of any interpersonal relationship, and also with ourselves. So thank you guys so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please share it. That is the best way to support us. If you want to contact Rick for sessions, you can. I will put his email in the show notes below. For more information on coaching and also to sign up for our newsletter, you can visit teamlocofit.com, and we will talk to you guys next week.